Go back almost 400 years to the year 1624. The famous landmarks and cities that make up the U.S. today were non-existent. Instead, untouched prairie fields covered the terrain as large swaths of open water met the horizon. Dutch settlers had just crossed the Hudson River and settled on its shores. They named this foreign land New Amsterdam. But fast forward 40 years to when the English took control of the area, and it was renamed New York. For more than 100 years, the English ruled over New York. It wasn't until November of 1783 that American troops led by General Washington and Governor Clinton drove the last of the British out. By this period, the region had grown to be an important part of America, but still looked nothing like the Big Apple of today.
The capital of the United States was in New York City, something that most people don't know. It was in New York City from 1785 through 1790, the Confederation Congress, and then the first Congress of the United States. George Washington was inaugurated as the first president in New York. The first Congress met in New York. The first freedoms were enacted in New York, the Bill of Rights that we now know of as that. And people just forget that our history has sort of been hijacked by places like Philadelphia, like Boston, certainly like Washington, D.C.
That's Sam Roberts, a longtime journalist for the New York Times and the author of the book, The New Yorkers, 31 Remarkable People, 400 Years, and the Untold Biography of the World's Greatest City. Roberts says that many Americans, even New Yorkers themselves, don't know the full history of the nation's largest metropolis.
Once figured out with a couple of demographers that as many as 1 billion people have lived in New York from the very beginning. Unfortunately, we don't have a good record of the Lenape people, who were the first people who lived in New York for thousands of years before the Europeans came. But when you look at the history of the city, it is a history built by people. The grid system, the system of streets, that rectangular grid that defined development in New York, the buildings, the Empire State Building that will always be the most iconic building in New York. Again, the Statue of Liberty, which all over the world became this welcoming symbol for immigrants who defined New York.
Aside from the landmarks, people tend to think of New York's famous food or its globally renowned music and art scene. But Roberts argues that the stories surrounding some remarkable New Yorkers should be held as equally important. One such narrative is that of Elizabeth Jennings Graham, an African-American woman who refused to get off a whites-only trolley in 1854.
Perfectly well-dressed, perfectly respectable, but it was a whites-only trolley, and she sued. She sued the trolley company. And her lawyer happened to be a man named Chester Arthur, a young lawyer who would later become the President of the United States. And as I point out in this book, she won her lawsuit in 1854 in Brooklyn Supreme Court. And this was 100 years before Rosa Parks. Nobody knows her name, Elizabeth Jennings, and she won this case, set a precedent that any respectable person, black or white, had every right to ride public transportation. She won a lawsuit, won $225 in damages, which was nearly her annual salary as a teacher.
The actions of Graham were unprecedented during the 1800s, yet her courage has been largely forgotten. Her demands for equality set a new legal precedent and pushed society in the right direction. And she wasn't the only outspoken woman from New York to make a lasting impact. Take, for instance, Carmelia Goff, a daughter of Caribbean immigrants.
She was instrumental in reviving a Brooklyn neighborhood that was a vast wasteland in the 1970s, East New York. It was just a bombed out section of the city. And she, with the help of her neighbors, rebuilt that neighborhood, just like the Irish, the Italians, other ethnic groups did in the 19th century. She had the gumption, the guts, the courage, the energy with her neighbors to rebuild that neighborhood. And that's what immigrants are doing today. And Immigrants have always done that, and they're doing it all over the United States. And I think that is the spirit of New York, the spirit of America that I wanted to capture in this book, The New Yorkers. And I think this woman, Carmelia Goff, is emblematic of that spirit and emblematic of the city of New York.
While some New Yorkers find themselves in situations where they can rise to the occasion, many other people move to the metropolis simply in the hopes that they'll make a name for themselves, and with good reason. Throughout history, the biggest names in media, finance, and other sectors have all built their empires from the ground up in New York City. One of these titans is a man named James Gordon Bennett, who's remarked by many as the founder of the modern newspaper.
He was sort of a madman in his own way, but he really established what was called the penny press in New York. He knew what people wanted to read, and he gave it to them. And what they wanted to read was news. He defined news about ordinary people, whether it was murders, whether it was financial news, whether it was gossip. And he built the New York Herald into a major newspaper.
Roberts also calls attention to one couple in the media industry who were instrumental in developing the modern interview format.
Tex McCrary and Jinx Falkenberg. They were, I think, the inventors of celebrity talk radio. And I find that fascinating because they weren't the first, but they were the ones who made it serious. And they, when you talk about celebrity today, they really invented talk radio in that sense. They put serious people on the radio. They interviewed them seriously. They asked them questions that people wanted answers to. And they developed it in a way that not as mushy, not as gossipy as it became today, but they allowed people listening to radio, which was the primary medium in the 30s, 40s, early 50s before television, allowed people to get their news and allowed people to get their information in a fairly sophisticated way.
In every facet of work or play, Roberts says New Yorkers of the past and present are strong, steadfast, and proud people who symbolize the strength of the city.
Whether it was the Great Fire during the Revolution, during the brutal British occupation, whether it was through 9/11, whether it was the Superstorm Sandy, whether it was the flu epidemic of 1919, the recent pandemic, we have had the resilience to keep coming back. When you see all the places in America and all over the world that have risen and fallen, to think that New York, since 1790, has been the largest city in the country, remains the largest. It's had its ups and downs, of course, but there's a reason for that. It has attracted these people, it has welcomed these people, and it has been a remarkable place. Not perfect by any means, not great, but it has risen to the occasion whenever it has had to.
To find out more about the impactful people of New York City and our guest, Sam Roberts, visit viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. Also, check out Roberts' new book, The New Yorkers, 31 Remarkable People, 400 Years, and the Untold Biography of the World's Greatest City, available online and in select bookstores now. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri, studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
If someone demonstrates financial needs, they should not be required to borrow anything. It should entirely be with grants.
Continuing the conversation about a lack of affordability in higher education. Then,
would you put a pet to sleep for a significant amount of money? Or would you alter or rework your child's college application if you thought it would get them into a college that they wouldn't otherwise get into?
Asking ourselves the difficult questions. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.